as, small tribes of hunter-gatherers, we would have been, typically 150 people per tribe, and we would have lived our whole life with these same people in very close quarters. I mean, we would have done everything together, hunted together, gathered together, ate together, and so forth. So our whole lives, we would have been surrounded with the same people, and we would have had very, very deep, personal connections with each one of them.
Messy and masterful. In this podcast, we speak about the success of people who have achieved, built, or done something amazing, special, remarkable, noteworthy, and/or fabulous. Think of presidents, doctors, chefs, architects, filmmakers, writers, philosophers, CEOs, journalists, and the list goes on and on of people who've had a genuine impact on this world. But rather than underlining their career victories, we speak about the challenges they needed to overcome to actually get there. In each episode, we discuss 3 of such challenges, obstacles, difficulties, and/or hurdles with our guest, putting the messy of their lives next to the masterful. A very warm welcome to you. My name is Alder Pap, and I'm so happy you could make it. So sit back, relax, and download the podcast here.
Yes, and a very good morning. It is a beautiful day. We're getting a little bit of sunshine here in Scotland, so it's still quite breezy, a little bit chilly, but I like the combination of the sunshine on my face and then the cold kind of gives me a little bit a kind of an idea of a skiing weather. And I have with me here our favorite guest, Dr. Michael Vlerik again. What's the weather like in Ghent?
Well, very similar. Beautiful sunshine and also kind of breezy and cold. And I also do like it. So wonderful.
Nice to get out for a walk if you have time, or a run, or
Yeah.
Whatever you prefer. Michael, thanks so much for joining us again. This is our 4th interview with you as a guest, but the official 2nd one in the series of why we are not happier, and actually for us, how we can make our listeners happier. That's actually our mission. We are allies in a mission to make you happier, dear listener. And in the last interview, we spoke about happiness and genetics. We called it happiness versus our genetics. Are we genetically programmed to be unhappy? That was kind of the crucial question. And Dr. Vlerik, you looked at it from all angles and said, well, this and that. And so, dear listener, if you are interested in that, then I would suggest to check out that interview on our podcast. And today, Michael, we're going to be talking about happiness and our modern environment. Let's start with this question. Is it happiness versus our modern environment, or is it happiness and our modern environment? Is it collaborative, or are we working against our modern environment here?
That's a very good question, Aldo. And as for last time, I would say to a certain extent it's versus our modern environment, but also to another extent it is thanks to our modern environment. So maybe we can start with the good news, right? So people have been studying happiness. I mean, scientists have been really studying happiness in different countries and cultures for the last, let's say, 50 years, a little bit more. And from that data, we can actually see that in general, the trend is towards slightly more well-being, slightly more happiness. So with the increased wealth and improved living conditions, improved security as well, less conflict and so forth, these positive trends in the world, well, we've seen that there was some increase in happiness. But, and here is the more saddening news, definitely not as much as one would hope or expect, given this enormous increase in wealth, for instance, right? So, and I think we've already briefly touched upon this. It does follow a bit, wealth, but not as much as one would expect. But so, if we're thinking about our modern environment versus, ancestral environments, the point here is definitely not that we're less happy than we used to be, but what I think we'll focus on today, there are certain elements in our modern environment that do clash with what I call our Stone Age brains, right? So we've got these brains that haven't evolved since the Stone Age. 150,000 years ago, we were biologically modern human beings. For the major part of our history as biologically modern human beings, well, we've lived as hunter-gatherers in small tribes. Now we live in a very different context, and predictably, in certain kind of aspects, this gets us into trouble when it comes to happiness.
Yeah. Well, let's dive in then. So there are aspects in our modern environment that go against our Stone Age happiness or our Stone Age instincts. Could you give me some examples?
Yeah, so I think the first one, or maybe, let's start with an example that I think is pretty telling, right? They call it a typical case of such an evolutionary mismatch, a mismatch between our biology and our environment now. And that is, our predilection for sugary and fatty foods. Well, this kind of predilection for these foods, this is what really kept us alive in times of food scarcity, calorie scarcity, and where the only sweet-tasting foods would have been ripe fruits, getting you the vital vitamin C and the vital energy and so forth. Right nowadays, with all of these fast food options, sugary foods, artificial foods, and so forth that are very unhealthy, well, obviously, it does not promote longevity and health anymore, right? So there's a kind of mismatch. You also see it with other species. For instance, think about the hedgehog, right? Whenever the hedgehog is in danger, what does it do? It curls up in a little ball, and then it's supposed to be protected by its spikes. Well, that does work wonderfully well in the natural world. In our modern world, with a lot of roads and cars, that's not the best strategy. And, well, yeah, they get just squished by these cars. Right, so a mismatch between an evolved strategy or an evolved psychological feature or physical feature and what actually the environment in which the organism lives now.
And what I think is so striking about this is that we're talking about foods that, from previous conversations are like carrots for us, right? So the foods that have sugar, they give us this, temporary happiness boost. And those are the most unhealthy for us. So it's almost, it's funny to see like, why are they there? Because they give us that little bit of happiness. But again, in the long run, it doesn't do anything for us.
Exactly. And we're going to be talking about addictions, craving, dopamine, and so forth. And so that really plays into there, right? So that's a very good point. But so as I was going to say, like the first major way, and it's such a major way, I would like to start with this, in which our evolved psychology kind of clashes with our modern environment and which has big repercussions for our well-being, is our stress response. Right, so we've evolved a stress response, which is incredibly useful to escape predators or an enemy that comes charging at you. It's this fight or flight response and reaction that comes immediately. So what happens when we have a stress response, right? So the blood goes from our digestive system into our muscles, so we can move and have outbursts of energy. Also, we see that the pupils will dilate. We take on more visual information. Mentally, we get into this tunnel vision, or immunity is suppressed as well. Now, all of this is wonderfully adapted, again, if there's a saber-toothed tiger ready to charge, right? So, and you need to act physically in a very forceful and instantaneous manner, right? That's wonderful. Your heart rate goes up, your blood starts pumping, blood pressure goes up. All of that is great. Now, today in our modern environment, we have way less of these acute stressors, right? There's no predators around the corner for most people, but we still do have stressors. These kind of low-key stressors, the deadline at work, the mortgage that needs to be paid, all of that stuff, they constantly trigger that, ancient stress mechanism. Now, for these stressors, for that deadline at work or for public speaking and so forth, well, this is not a helpful response. Quite to the contrary, right? So you get into this kind of tunnel vision, and sometimes this prevents you from seeing a good solution. And also, it's an awfully unhealthy response if it becomes chronic, right? And we see that quite often because many of these stressors are around in our modern environment. So we're maybe not stressed as, acutely as we were before, at least in ancestral times. But these smaller stressors are much more frequent in our modern environment. So we suffer from this kind of chronic stress. And since it suppresses the immune system and the digestive system, people get ulcers, become sick more often. They get cardiovascular problems because of the elevated blood pressure and so forth. So it's awful for our health. It's really a killer, as I think most people know. But as you can imagine, it also has a major toll on our psychological well-being.
I'm just thinking about the stress that I have, indeed, that I so recognize when I need to organize something, often administrative, which is I don't like doing, right? So, make sure that we're up to date with the payments, or the accountant has all necessary information, etc., etc., etc. Are these things developed to cause stress? Have we been intentional in the design of, for instance, saying, final reminder for payment or final notice or whatever it's called, that they cause stress with the recipient? So are we complicit in creating that stress as a society as a whole, or do you think it's less intentional?
Well, I think it might indeed help, to help your case, that is, to kind of stress people to get certain things done. So in that sense, there might be some intentional aspects to it, but I think in general, right, what happens here is that life is always going to give you certain stressors, certain to-dos, and for certain stressors, this kind of response, the typical stress, the biological stress response we have, is an appropriate one. But in our modern environment, for most of these stressors, it actually is not the appropriate one. It's completely useless. It's counterproductive, and as I said, it's so bad for our health, but also for our psychological well-being. And I think a lot of the burnout epidemic that they talk about, I mean, depression, anxiety disorders, and so forth, are by psychologists are being linked to this kind of chronic stress.
Yeah. Go on, my dear friend. Sorry for interrupting you. I'm just curious, and I just ask you every single question, approaching you like you are an oracle of some sorts. I appreciate that sometimes I'm asking a question like I don't have the answer to that. It's just my own curiosity.
No, thanks, and thanks for these questions, Aldo, because it makes a very interesting conversation. But so that's kind of the major first element, right? So this kind of stress response. And now I'm just already looking forward to something we'll cover in one of the coming episodes. We'll see that a major way to increase our well-being will be to deal with that stress response and to have, this kind of different, I would say, a different way of relating to these feelings of stress and these thoughts that are caused by stress and so forth. Right, so this is definitely coming up. There's a lot we can do about that chronic stress. So if the listener is really recognizing this and seeing that it has a toll on his or her health and well-being, well, know that you don't have to be a victim. You can actually do something profoundly change this. And so this is coming up. Maybe from there we can go to a second way in which, our modern environment causes trouble, and that is our sedentary lifestyle. Right, so we've evolved to kind of be on the move constantly. We're nomadic, also to have to move a lot and do a lot of physical exertion to get our calories, go hunting, go gathering, and so forth. Right, today we live in a world where many of us, at least, can provide perfect living in a completely sedentary way, right? So we go to the office, we're seated, we go by car, we're seated in the car, we go to the supermarket, get all of our food for a whole week, massive amount of calories without having to move a lot, and so forth. So if we want to, we can actually just stay seated for, and lay down for the biggest part of our days. And this actually, again, I think this is very well known, has a big toll on our physical health, obviously, cardiovascular health and so forth, but also on our well-being. And this is becoming more and more clear, right? And again, this is not by coincidence. Now, remember what we said in the last episode in which, our genes kind of guide us through the environment and so forth. And so our genetic makeup, our psychological makeup, is such that when we stay seated for incredibly long times and we barely move physically, well, then our genes, quote unquote, obviously they're not conscious beings and so forth, but they get the signal that we're not doing great stuff for our survival and reproduction. They're like, okay, this organism is just, idling around, is not doing anything to survive. This is a problem. So what do? They flood our system again with cortisol and so forth, with this kind of chronic stress. So this really increases this chronic stress, and they also withhold us from the so-called happiness hormones, or actually more accurately, the happiness neurotransmitters like serotonin, which is produced when we do things that are good for our survival, and so forth. Like I call it the "I'm doing well" happiness neurotransmitter. Dopamine, and we'll talk about that, the I want neurotransmitter, and so forth. So it leads to a more listless life, a lower self-esteem as well. Like all of these things have been connected to a lack of physical movement, and also it greatly increases the chances of having a depression. Right, so again, this modern environment in which physical exercise is no longer a necessity kind of clashes with our evolved psychology, in which we had to move in those ancestral times. We had to move in order to survive and reproduce. When we didn't move, that was a major problem. So to adopt the analogy we developed last time in the last episode, well, our genes unleash the sticks on us, right, and we suffer the physical, but definitely also the mental consequences.
And so kind of what I think every time is, with each feature that you're describing, I think every time is like, we know better, right? We know that this is a problem for us. We know, yet why are we doing the opposite? There's something so contradictory in this. It's like, we know that we shouldn't, we know, and yet we do it.
Exactly, especially when it comes to physical exercise. At least for physical health, it's been known quite some time, and I think all the listeners will know this, that it is important for your physical health to move, and still we often do not do that enough. And that actually has to do with another aspect, right? So we also possess this kind of inbuilt laziness when it comes to physical exertion. And you could say this is very much a mismatch as well. This inbuilt laziness was something that would help us conserve energy in ancestral times, where again, calories were scarce and so forth. So if you didn't exert yourself when you didn't really have to get more food, to escape and predators and so forth, well, that was the best possible strategy. Right, but then it would have been counteracted with, the drive by hunger and thirst to go and move and get the proper resources and so forth. So you would have moved a lot, right? But not more than you had to, because then it would have become counterproductive. You would have expended too much energy, and again, in a context in which calories are not abundantly available, this is the best way to go about it. Now, in our modern environment, well, we don't have any of these drivers, or at least for most people, we don't have these drivers to go and move and do something about our survival, to physically move in order to survive, driven by thirst, hunger. I mean, it's no harder for us to kind of quench our thirst and satiate our hunger, just going downstairs to the kitchen, opening an over full fridge, and then getting out whatever you want there. So these drivers no longer make us move, and the laziness, or this tendency to conserve energy, is still very much part of our psychology. And so it's very hard for us to say, like, okay, now I'm going out of the door and I'm going to do a run for half an hour just for my physical health and so forth.
Yeah. There is no need, as you say, right? If there's no need, then why would we?
Exactly.
And you could say, well, there is a need, again, you need to do this for your health or whatever, but that's not enough.
Yeah, that's a conscious reasoning that comes on top, and so people do this, but it's quite hard, right? It's not like this emotional drive to go and do this. Yeah.
Well, thankfully, people are, right? Let's not be too doom and gloom.
No.
There are loads of people that are working on it, but it's not an obvious thing. You need to make the conscious choice that you will. and indeed build in moments in your day to move. Otherwise, you're just not going to.
Exactly.
You're
And
not
I
going
think
to.
very importantly, and this is kind of more the personal trainer in me that wakes up and then less what I write in the book, right? But very importantly, try to do something that you enjoy and also know that it's never too short, a period of time to do some movement. It's much better to move for
Yeah,
10 minutes in the morning if you don't have a half an hour or you don't have an hour. People often think, well, it's not
yeah,
worth to do any physical training there. That's not true. You can do, 100 squats and 100 push-ups if you want, and that will make a massive
yeah,
difference. But definitely try to do
yeah,
something that you enjoy, that you find intrinsically rewarding, because then you will come back to
yeah,
do these physical exercises. If you do something that is really punishing to you psychologically and you only do it by grit and willpower, well, you only have got so much of willpower and you probably won't do it in the long
yeah,
run.
yeah. Great. Any more features?
All right, so we've covered the stress response, we've covered the sedentary lifestyle and the kind of vicious circle they get us in, right? Because interestingly, and saddeningly, well, this sedentary lifestyle makes us more prone to stress, so it feeds into that stress and so forth. And what you can also see, and this kind of links to the next thing I definitely want to cover, that is that when we're in the grips of this low-level stress response, that we often succumb to this kind of artificial ways of making us feel better in the short term. Right, so these artificial dopamine boosts, and then we're going to get into that in a second. Alcohol, certain kind of drugs, but also scrolling on social media, gambling, and so forth. So all of these addictive things, well, what they do is they give us this momentary kind of euphoric feeling, or at least they give us a little boost because they artificially enhance the dopamine neurotransmitter in our brain, so our levels of dopamine go up. And again, dopamine is a very interesting neurotransmitter, just like the other neurotransmitters. That does a lot of things, right? It's involved in memory, different ways of cognition, and a whole bunch of stuff. And the more researchers find out about these neurotransmitters, the more they see how incredibly complex their working and interaction is, and so forth. So we're definitely simplifying here. But when it comes to well-being, dopamine is actually our I want kind of neurotransmitter. When we get a
Yeah,
shot of dopamine, we have a strong urge to kind of get something, right? So it's the carrot of all carrots almost, right? So it's what our
yeah.
genes use to make us get that reproductive opportunity, get that good food source, and so forth. That is what dopamine evolved to do.
I don't know about you, but I am someone who really loves a true crime series. I just can't get enough of them. If I watch them on the streaming platforms, I really cannot stop binging on them. It really is a guilty pleasure. So if you're like me, then you are going to love coldcaseinc.com, which is a platform that offers you unsolved cases of fictional murder mysteries that you can solve. It's a great community of detectives that come together, offering you video and audio evidence, and step by step you can play the game of solving this murder mystery by yourself. We've paired up with the team at coldcaseinc.com, and if you use our code, which is the word MESSY in capital letters, MESSY, then you even get a 15% off your first online membership. So do check out coldcaseinc.com and get crime solving today. We are very happy to be partnering with the Code Zone, which is this amazing platform where people can come together to learn how to code. Creators and future makers, they all come together here, both children as well as adults, to learn how to code and develop things, like for instance their own videos or Minecraft mods. The team at CodeZone believes everyone should be able to learn how to code, young or old, and they've got these amazing subscriptions, very easy and very cheap. You'll learn a lot from them. You could do it live or you could do it in your own time at your own leisure. We highly recommend it. They are tailored to support individual interests and capabilities, and I'm sure that once you get hooked on the Code Zone, you never want anything more. Check it out, thecodezone.co.uk or the URL in our show notes.
And so today we found all of these artificial ways of increasing that dopamine. Chemical compounds, again, like alcohol and certain drugs, not all drugs, but all of the addictive drugs, but also, as I said, other things like social media and gambling actually have been shown to kind of boost that dopamine.
And it is really in us already from a young age, right? Many times over, I've used my daughter in these interviews, but my daughter, I'm pretty sure, gets a dopamine kick from if she receives a toy.
Oh yeah, I'm sure she
So,
does. Yeah.
so she asks for a toy. Like a toy is like the reward, but it's very, very quickly plateaus. Once she's got the toy, it's no longer of interest. Similar to the McDonald's thing. But she's 4 years old, and I wonder, like, where does this come from? That this toy, what does this toy do for us? And I recognize it being a child myself, that it's designed to kind of make us want it, right? It has the fluffiness and the colors, and it has all these things that little kids like. But I'm like, what are you searching for? What, in your brain subconsciously is this toy going to give you? And, why do you so deeply desire it?
Yeah, so the very interesting thing here is what you said is how quickly we get used to that, right? And we've already covered hedonic adaptation in the last in our
Yeah.
last interview. I won't
Yeah.
explain it all over again, but
No,
maybe something on the workings of dopamine. And so
no.
let me actually just quickly cover one of the most important studies done on this. It was done on monkeys first. And so what they did is, well, they gave these monkeys water and like celery and certain kind of vegetables, perfectly fine for monkeys. They survive on it, but they're not absolutely loving this, right? So then this one time they ring a bell and they give the monkeys orange juice. Now, monkeys do love their orange juice, just like us. They're craving for that sugary good. And so, as you could see, the dopamine levels, flash through the roof. And very quickly, after that, the dopamine levels would crash again and they would scream for more, right? And they become more aggressive and aggressive and they really want more. And now you give them celery and they're really displeased, right? They throw it back to the experimenter. Now, interestingly, they've done that. They've conditioned them to expect their orange juice reward after ringing the bell. So they do this for a number of days, and each time they ring the bell, just like Pavlov's dogs, and then they get the orange juice, right? So now they're perfectly conditioned to expect the orange juice after the bell. And so what they did is they measured their dopamine in through, not ringing the bell, getting the orange juice, consuming the orange juice, and afterwards, right? And what they found is that actually dopamine peaks when they hear the bell, not when they get the orange juice, which is like a minute later, right? So it peaks in the anticipation of a good thing. And whenever the good thing is there, it very, very quickly, incredibly quickly starts to drop again. Right, and so this is what's happening in humans as well, right? Our dopamine peaks right before we have, this carrot, right? When we can almost sense it, we feel it, we almost have it. That's when it peaks, right? So the chase, in a way, is better than the catch, and so that's the first thing. And again, from an evolutionary point of view, this is logical because our genes want us to get this next carrot, and so they do anything, and they really are gonna up the ante, so to speak, kind of to make us grasp that opportunity. Once, the good thing is in our possession and the food source, the reproductive opportunity, whatever, then it very quickly, diminishes us and lets us unsatisfied or leaves us unsatisfied, craving for more, craving for this new carrot. And so that's the whole point. Always more, always more. And so it's not a coincidence that dopamine crashes so quickly. It is a feature of the whole system.
Yeah.
But so it causes quite a bit of problems, right?
So remind me, we needed it in the Stone Age. We needed it to be able to catch our prey, right? To be able to go after something in order to survive.
Exactly.
That was the original intention of dopamine.
Yeah, no,
correct?
very much so. Yeah, to make us seize opportunities, right? So yeah.
Yeah.
And we still need it, to go do things and so forth. And also, and this is one of the problems we're getting into. I mean, we need, a kind of steady flow of dopamine to make us feel good, right? In the absence of dopamine, we feel really listless. It's almost, depression symptoms, right? I mean, we have no energy for nothing, we don't feel good, and so forth, right? So we do need dopamine. But the problem is, and this is where, the clash with our modern environment comes in. The problem is when we have all of these artificial ways of increasing our dopamine, like certain chemicals, again, alcohol, but also drugs like cocaine and heroin, very addictive drugs, that really work on that dopamine system and that are in the short term gonna really, ramp up the dopamine production. And then obviously we're gonna come crashing down again. But also, again, different addictive stuff like social media. Not a coincidence there that we get a lot of dopamine to kind of when we go on social media because, understanding, and we've also covered this last time, understanding your social environment, knowing who likes who and who ranks where, and remember the status obsession and so forth, was incredibly important for our survival and reproductive chances. So anytime we kind of engage in behavior that that tries to win new information, more information about this social context and about other people, about their status, we're going to be rewarded, so to speak, with dopamine, and also we're going to be driven to go get that information with dopamine, right? So, but that makes it also addictive, right? When it comes to social media, there's this endless source of that type of information, and we can get lost in
Yeah.
it.
And we have yet to see what the repercussions of that will be, right? I mean, already you see certain things happening, like the bad side of social media. I know in previous interviews you said it has a good and a bad side, but the bad side, the implications on our psychology, on our mental health, I think we're about to find out kind of what's happening here. We had a neuroscientist also as a guest on Messy and Masterful, Dr. Michael Trayford, and he said, like, the biggest problem of our time is to quiet the mind, which has all to do with focus and us just being able to decide our path, getting ourselves to accomplishments, which is so important, for our existence, that we achieve something, right? Whatever it is, that we catch that prey. But if we can't quiet our mind and if we can't define our ambition because we're continuously distracted by things that we see on, for instance, social media, now how can we achieve that? We're building loads of kind of obstacles in our way with social media because, not a day goes by that you're not distracted. That's another conversation, but I just wanted to, I think that's a fascinating way of looking at it. Like, social media doesn't allow us to quiet our mind, which we need to define. Okay, what are we going to hunt for? What are we going to look for? What is our ambition?
No, definitely, and attention is everything in a way in our experience of the world. When we don't have attention, we're at the whims of whatever crosses our mind, whatever, and so we're going to see also in one of the coming episodes how we can kind of cultivate and strengthen that attention, and obviously meditation plays a key role in there, and kind of counteracts this, as you say, environment in which attention spans become shorter and shorter, and then I see it in my own kids as well, and it's problematic, right? And so there's all these short YouTube movies that follow one another, and so forth, and nobody can sit through a 10-minute movie anymore, or perhaps through this whole interview. But that's definitely something we're going to come back to. But in the context of what we're talking now and addiction and social media, I think that the last estimates, and they're probably already kind of dated, is that more than 200 million people worldwide already suffer from some kind of addiction to social media. So it's massive, and it exists since, I don't know, 10, 15 years perhaps. So we're just at the beginning of this, and we're completely unarmed. We were unwarned at the beginning as well. And I think now it becomes more and more clear what massive negative consequences, overuse of social media can have. So, since,
Yeah.
as you say, and as we said in the previous episodes, well, not all social media use is problematic, but I think, especially in youngsters, they find that if young people, adolescents, are more than 2 hours on social media, well, the numbers are crazy, but their chances of suffering from a depression, skyrocket, and they feel way more socially isolated, ironically, paradoxically, right? So they're constantly, communicating or at least getting social information, but they don't actually have physical interactions with one another, and these are so important for a social species like human beings. So that's a major problem, and maybe in general about addictions, right? Because it's very interesting what feeds into addiction and also how you can get rid of addictions. And so for the longest time, we thought like, well, you have, and now I'm focusing on the well-known addictions again, the older ones, alcohol, other drugs. We thought, well, yeah, these compounds, these chemical compounds are incredibly addictive, and you get in the grips of these compounds, and then, yeah, you're kind of lost. Right, but there's interesting research that shows that it is actually a bit more complex than that. Right. So first of all, and this is a study that many people will have heard of, I think it's already done in the 1950s, so very old studies. And what they did is they hooked up rats with electrodes on their brains, and they stimulated certain areas of the brain. And the rats, they could, pull a little lever, and they could kind of stimulate that part of the brain. And some rats, when they hooked up, these electrodes in a certain way, some rats, didn't eat anymore, didn't drink anymore, and just pulled that lever until they died. They literally died because of not eating and drinking. And so, the researchers thought, like, well, we definitely have found a reward center in the brain because, these rats will just stimulate that area and they will forgo all of their, vital needs, and some rats at least, and die, right? So what we know now is that what actually happened is that because they set up these electrodes in a certain way, well, the brains of these rats were flooded with dopamine, right? So it's I want more of this, I want more of this, whatever this was, I want more of this. So the lever, again, all of the other stuff doesn't matter anymore. So incredibly deep addiction, if you will, right? They then had a different experiment. They said, like, okay, let's do the rat experiment again, and we have two groups of rats. One group is in this empty cage just by themselves, like in the first experiment. The other rats are actually in group, and they have this very fun cage with a lot of play and so forth, tunnels, and so a good environment for rats. And they had the opportunity to kind of get water that was, I think it was laced with heroin, and then just plain water, right? And so at first, all of the rats try both, and so they get the effect of the heroin, and then they see, okay, this is just water. Anyways, as you can imagine, in the empty cages, a lot of the rats got incredibly addicted to the heroin, and kind of similar story, right? Not much eating going on and so forth, and would die pretty soon. Now, in what they call the rat park, when they had all of the fun toys and so forth, and then they were in a social environment, there were other rats there. Well, most rats, almost all of them, they tasted from the heroin, but then they didn't get addicted. So they kept on playing, and they prefer the water typically. At least, they would take sips of the heroin water only, very sparsely and not so frequently, right? And so the environment is crucial for whether or not you're going to go for these artificial dopamine hits the whole time. And something similar is the case in humans, right? So they didn't have these experiments with humans. You can imagine that would be kind of unethical. There's even questions if it's ethical with rats, but definitely with humans, that is a no-go.
Not be way to go, no.
But there's an interesting historical experiment, and that is the Vietnam War. So you had all of the American soldiers in Vietnam, and they were obviously in an awful context of war and so forth. And also there was a lot of very cheap heroin available. So a large percentage of these American soldiers were very addicted to heroin. And when they got back home, U.S. government knew about this and was pretty worried, like what's going to happen if we're going to have all of these, junkie soldiers come back to the US. It's going to be a massive epidemic of heroin addicts. But then it turned out that 95% of these addicts actually, when they came back to the US, back into their normal environment with their friends, their family, an environment in which they had never consumed heroin and so forth, they were able to beat the addiction very simply, and they never used again. Right? So again, the environment changed, and therefore the grip that that very addictive drug had on them, well, actually was loosened. So it's definitely not the case that once there is this way of artificially boosting dopamine that, well, there's nothing you can do, you're defenseless and so forth. It's much more complex than that. The environment is also key in whether or not you're going to fall for an addiction or whether or not you're going to beat an addiction.
But what I do think is striking, going back to the example of the rats and the lever, is that the addiction prevails. So that, if we were to transfer that to us human beings, that we don't care about eating or drinking or personal hygiene anymore. We just want to kind of get our kick for that addiction, which is something that is unfortunately seen with severe addicts, right? Drug addicts or whatever. They don't care about their eating or their, any standards anymore. They all go out of the door. It's just getting that next hit. So they're obviously in the wrong environment and are not lifted out of that environment, or there's, of course, it's a very complex problem. But what I do think is striking is that it prevails from those things that make us survive at the end of the day. I thought that we have a baseline almost for us human beings to survive, that, if we don't have food, we will look for food, right? We will start hunting, or we will start doing something to feed ourselves, or look for water, or, that baseline is fulfilled. But it doesn't if we're addicted, severely addicted.
And these addictions are actually hijacking our brain chemistry, and that's the whole point, right? Or dopamine would have always led us to do things for our survival and reproduction in ancestral environments. But in this modern context in which we found these compounds or activities that kind of hijack these dopamine centers in our brain, well, we get behavior that is obviously not conducive to survival, definitely. And so maybe to kind of go on about this and for a little bit more, I think it's very important to know that I think even if you're not addicted to certain substances, well, that these artificial ways of boosting dopamine, again, the typical ways in our Western environments are alcohol, perhaps certain other drugs that we've covered, but also social media, gambling, that kind of stuff, right? So they give you a kind of temporary euphoric feeling. Well, there's three important issues there, and warnings at least, to overuse these artificial ways of upping your dopamine. The first is that when you excessively start using them, that your craving for this particular artificial carrot, I call it, whatever it be it alcohol or social media, that craving is going to increase, right? So you're going to be in the grips of an unpleasant craving to consume that specific drug again, or do that particular addictive behavior, right? So to that, you become addictive to that particular little dopamine surge. Now that's one thing, and that we all know. A second one, a very important one as well, is that the reward you get for that same glass of alcohol going on the social media over time becomes lesser and less, right? So the reward will diminish. Because your brain is like, okay, I'm getting all of these dopamine spikes, and it becomes better at absorbing that dopamine and not producing that big euphoric feeling. So it kind of works against it because it's being flooded artificially with dopamine, and so it becomes better at actually, absorbing that dopamine and not leaving you for long with the euphoric feeling. So the reward starts to diminish. And then perhaps most problematic is that since you're constantly spiking, your brain with these artificial dopamine hits, that your natural dopamine production is going down because your brain is getting the signal like, we're getting all of this dopamine. Stop the production, right? So that means that, when you're not consuming, your life becomes a bit more listless. You have less fun in life in general, right? So, and then obviously, and that's a vicious circle, right? This will only drive you to consume more and more, and this will enhance this effect and so forth. And then, so that's very much the vicious circle of addiction. And again, you don't have to be crazy excessive user or really addicted to kind of notice that. I mean, I think to a certain extent we've all noticed that. Perhaps, when you remember the first few times, as a real young person, where you used alcohol, for instance, and then you were really euphoric, and now you still have drinks over the weekends with your friends, and yes, it gives you a little bit of a kick, but it probably does not compare to these massive euphoric feelings you first experienced when you first, tasted from that artificial carrot, right? So the reward, over time becomes less. And that definitely also goes for these other addictive elements we have in our environment, like social media.
Yeah. Tell me about loneliness. Sorry, I don't. I know you're looking at your notes, Dr. Vlerik. Like you're like, well, hold on. Let's not talk about loneliness because I'm not there yet. But before we clicked recording, you said something very interesting, and there was also an article in the Financial Times about that, which is that in this day and age, loads of people are lonely, and it looks like we are at the moment where we never have been as lonely as we are today. When we talk about modern times and our happiness, I'm sure this is a challenge of these days. How did we get ourselves in such a situation?
Yeah, so that's a massive one, and I think estimates actually show that 1/3 of adults today suffer from loneliness. So they call it the loneliness epidemic, and the numbers are enormous, and it's incredibly, incredibly worrisome. Now, again, you have to consider that the way we're actually primed to live together and engage with other people is as small tribes of hunter-gatherers. We would have been typically 150 people per tribe, and we would have lived our whole life with these same people in very close connection, in very close quarters. We would have done everything together, hunted together, gathered together, ate together, and so forth. So our whole lives we would have been surrounded with the same people, and we would have had very, very deep, personal connections with each one of them.
There is no point in denying it. I am in love. And you might have already known it, that I was in love with podcasting and interviewing people all over the world. Well, I'm also in love now with a recording tool for our podcast episodes, which is called Riverside.fm. I've kissed many frogs when it came to recording episodes, but this one is really the one with the most amazing studio features. Riverside really offers you everything you need in creating the perfect episode, whether these are short or long, whether these are multiple people you're talking to or just you, or whether this is about your show notes or the video recording or even creating easy snippets that you can use on social media. Riverside truly has it all. If you go to our show notes, you will find a link to Riverside, and if you use that link, you'll even get a 20% discount. Yes, you heard that correctly, a 20% discount in getting started with this incredible podcast recording tool. Look no more, Riverside.fm is here.
Right, so that is where we come from. That is the way we lived for 95% of our history as biologically modern beings. Now today, ironically, we live in an overpopulated world, and I think almost half of the people live in a city today, in which we live in even closer quarters with a lot of people, but it's a very different social context. It's not a social context in which you would always be surrounded by the people you know very well, you love, and so forth, so we can have friends all over the world now. And more people become socially isolated in these big anonymous social settings, and so that is a massive problem for obviously our well-being. We suffer from it, even for our physical health.
Yeah, and there's no age discrimination here, right? It happens to people of all ages. It sounds like, because in the olden days, they were saying, well, if you're older, unfortunately, people pass, or children move out, they might move further away, etc., etc. But this is loneliness already that can start very early. That this is not, again, discriminatory of any person on any
Yeah,
age.
it definitely can happen to anybody, or at least, all groups of people suffer from it, but some more than others. And then, so as you mentioned, old people can become isolated. Again, when you would have been an old person in a hunter-gatherer tribe, well, you would still be very much part of the tribe. See your kids, grandkids, your friends, those who are still around, but otherwise, their kids and so forth on a daily basis. And this is no longer the case. And so many old people do suffer from loneliness, definitely. There's also, and I don't know the exact numbers there, but there's also a difference between the sexes. I think more men, at least young men, suffer from loneliness than women, for instance, because
Yeah.
perhaps, and we can go into this, but I'm not really an expert on this, but they're more naturally sociable quite often, women, and they have more ways of socializing and so forth. And so there are differences, but again, it happens to all groups of people.
Yeah.
And then perhaps to continue on this, right? Why is this such a problem psychologically and even physically, as I'm going to explain? Well, again, we have to consider what our genes, how they interpret this social isolation. Being socially isolated in ancestral times would have been a death sentence, right? So you cannot make it by yourself. If you're socially isolated, well, then you're a goner, so to speak, right? So your genes consider this the most problematic scenario. And therefore, when they feel that you become more and more socially isolated, what are they going to do to prevent this from happening? Well, their response to everything that's bad for their own replication ambitions, well, they're going to unleash the sticks on you, right? So they're going to give you a chronic stress response and so forth. So again, the stress response. And so this obviously has major repercussions on well-being. People deeply, deeply suffer when they're socially isolated, but also, amazingly, it really shortens lifespan. I mean, one of the biggest predictors for old people of how much longer they will live is the quality of their social network. And I mean, the amount of loving interactions they still have, and just interaction in general, but especially loving interactions they still have on a daily basis. So we're a deeply, deeply social species. And as members of a social species, well, social contexts are incredibly vital to anything for our functioning, our well-being, but also our physical health.
It's such a massive problem. You've noticed that I've gone a bit quiet, very unlike myself, but it's such a massive problem. And I think one of the reasons that we allowed it to happen is because we see the alternative as also, we think, helping us to combat loneliness. So I live in the UK. My parents-in-law, as well as my parents, do not live in the same country as I do. So for seeing their grandchild, we use video call-in tools. Now, to a certain extent, it might help a little, but it's not the same as being part of the pack, as you said, in the beginning. Calling each other or looking at each other on a video screen is very different than being in each other's presence.
Exactly. It's better than nothing, that is for sure, but it is not a replacement. And I think we've all experienced this in the COVID lockdowns, right? Where, I mean, that was the only means of getting into contact with friends and so forth. And, well, we found that it's not the same. And also the numbers show this. I think in the COVID pandemic, due to this, forced social isolation, the chance of contracting a depression went up with 4.5 times, right, for people. So massive again, and it shows this incredible importance of, actual physical social contacts for our well-being.
Yeah.
And we often, this is an interesting kind of side note, but we often don't make that reflection, or at least not in a certain way. We all know it's fun to hang out with very good friends and so forth. But even, these kind of, you could say, what we often consider as meaningless social contacts do play a role, right? So in a happy life, Well, researchers found that, for instance, when we have like lots of these small talks during our day, like for instance with a cashier in a shop and so forth, like small little conversations with people, that it really boosts our happiness. And we
Yeah.
often tend to think the opposite, right? So we think like, oh, let's not bother and seeing an actual cashier. Let's go at the self checkout. It's much easier, less hassle. I don't have to,
Yeah.
do a little bit of small talk. I know I'm
Oh,
guilty of this myself. And then, but
yeah.
research shows that actually you will feel better if you actually go for the physical interaction and the actual interaction with another
Yeah.
person, even if you don't know that person. Right, and so
Yeah.
in our modern environment in which we make everything more automatic, well, we also take this element out of the equation, right? So there's way less
Yeah.
interactions with other people, even small,
Yeah.
quote unquote meaningless, because they're not meaningless interactions.
Yeah. Again, what I wonder, and throughout this entire conversation, is why are we being so intentionally self-destructive here? There are so many elements that I hear you saying, like, don't eat too much sugar, make sure you continue to move, make sure you stay part of a social environment or a social network. Yet everything we develop and that we bring to our fellow human beings is all about doing the contrary, right? So more candy, more toys, more social media, automate more, doing more online shopping and whatever more. Is it all convenience? Is convenience going to be the killer here of our happiness at the end of the day?
Yeah, well, I think, and that's why I talked about this mismatch, right? I think it depends. And in all of these cases, there's a kind of mismatch between a natural response and the outcome of that natural response in the modern world, right? Just like the hedgehog gets into trouble when it goes for its natural response to a threat, which is to curl up when there's a car coming. Well, we
Yeah.
predictably get into trouble in certain kind of contexts in our modern environment. And so, yeah, sure, the not moving enough. Again, we talked about that natural response to conserve energy, which was great for the most part of our history. But now, I mean, gets us into trouble in an environment in which we don't have to move to survive.
Yeah.
Secondly, the addictions, obviously, they hijack these parts of our brains. So we've got that psychology, we've got that dopamine system. And well, we stumbled upon ways to hijack that. And it seemed like a really good plan in the beginning when you have that little euphoric high. But in the long term, it's disastrous. And so, but that makes it so very, very hard for us, even if we know, well, my long term happiness would be served by not drinking too much alcohol, not going for this addictive behavior. It's still incredibly tempting to do so. I mean, because we will have that anticipation of that dopamine kick, and that's very hard to ignore for us. And
Yeah.
yeah, so it's very important to know these things, to know that these carrots that seem so alluring are not only false, but quite often, straightforward poisonous. And I think we're only since not too long, we've known, for instance, that many of these addictive compounds, obviously, they were disastrous for our physical health, also for our mental health. But it goes deeper than that, right? The small addictive behaviors, the cell phone addiction, and so forth. And so, as you said, we're only scratching the surface there. And what we can say is that our brains did not evolve to deal with this, and this is something very different. And the consequences we're already seeing now are pretty massive. So it's very important to be well informed there and to proceed cautiously.
Let me go to the other side because I don't want to stay all doom and gloom. Can we adapt to the new normal, to this modern environment, and can we counter all these things that you previously described, all these modern society ailments?
Yeah, I think we can do a lot of these. It starts with information, and that's why we went for the doom and gloom part. But also, I want to emphasize again that we can and should be very thankful for our modern environment. Actually, our improved living conditions are something to be incredibly grateful for. And maybe to put this in perspective, right? So in the beginning of the 20th century, I think more than 90% of the world population was living in extreme poverty, right? So that means that if there's some kind of crop failure, there would be massive famine and so forth, right? Now, I mean, extreme poverty has dropped below 8%, despite a massively increased world population. right? But also think about, our health and the fact that now we can cure so many diseases. Back in ancestral times, and these numbers are staggering, but 1/4 of newborns wouldn't make it to the first year. Half of the children would die before puberty, right? And maybe even
Yeah.
more. These are still pretty cautious estimates. Right, so we cannot imagine what it was like before. So I'm definitely not saying like, oh, well, it was perfect back in ancestral times, and now we're
Yeah.
suffering because all of this. No. In the bigger scheme of things, we should and can be incredibly, incredibly grateful for these improved living conditions. But, and this is where the doom and gloom came in, well, there are certain specific elements in which, we get into trouble. And so knowing these areas, and I think knowledge and information is key there, right? It enables us
Yeah.
to again, proceed cautiously and make sure we don't fall prey to this.
Yeah, and there's a certain thing of taking it for what it is worth, because what you're saying is like, life has never been as good as it is today for us human beings, is not something that, a child knows, right? Because a child is born in this time and day. Only later you start wondering, oh, how was it for my ancestors? But that doesn't happen in the first 20 years, if not 30 years of your life, really, right? So it's the new normal for them, and they need to cope with the troubles of their times, of the challenges of their times, however good they are, right? Like, So I appreciate what you're saying, but it's not something that someone sees every single time, every day, because it's not part of their reality, really. And I think then the next bit is we're looking at happiness. We're looking at things that could potentially endanger our happiness. And, not to stay on the doom and gloom, there are already so many other things in our society today that do make us happy, right? Let's not forget about those. We also take those for granted, right? It's not that these are just risks that we're trying to expose here and that we're talking about. They're not necessarily the default for each and every one of us.
Definitely. And I think, and we're getting to that in one of the coming episodes, but what really empowers you to, not succumb to these artificial carrots, so to speak, with all the consequences down the line and so forth, and get the types of behavior that have been shown to increase your long-term happiness, is habit formation, right? So we're going to talk about, well, what can you do to, first of all, create the proper habits, right? Perhaps exercise more. We're going to see meditation, can have a major impact and so forth. So how can you get these habits rolling, right? That's a first very important one. But then also, how can you kind of lose, unhelpful habits? And actually, an addiction is nothing more than a very, very entrenched, bad habit in a way. And research has definite strategies that can really, really help there. But so this is definitely coming up. And in a way, our lives and the way we live our lives are just a consequence of the habits that we form. But most of the habits we form unintentionally. And so these are not always good habits. So getting a grip on habits is the key feature to actually protect yourselves against, what threatens your long-term happiness, and get more of the stuff that will increase your long-term happiness.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Dr. Vlarik. Anything more that we should be talking about when we're talking about happiness and our modern times? Anything more that you wanted to bring to the attention of our listeners that that they should know about, that we haven't discussed previously, or that we are going to discuss in the future?
No, I think I'm fine, but I would like to say one thing to kind of cap off the last two episodes in which it was kind of doom and gloom, right? So we've talked about happiness versus or genes, right, in the last episode, and like we've discovered that, we developed, and this goes for all humans, certain kind of psychological characteristics that stand in the way of our happiness. Remember, the focus on everything that could go bad, the negativity bias and so forth, and then hedonic adaptation, the fact that we get used to all of this good stuff. Now we've seen that despite, and we shouldn't be blind to this, but despite all of the progress and then the wonderful features of our modern environment, well, there's also certain features that can kind of stand in the way of our happiness. And the way I ended this in the book as well is with a kind of thought experiment, right? And this is going to be looking at what comes. So imagine the life of these distant ancestors, right? So they lived 100,000 years ago, let's say. And if you could, interview them, you could go back in time and then meet one of those distant ancestors and you could interview them and ask them about their dream life, their pure utopia. Well, they might have said something like this. Well, a world in which there's always enough to eat, never famine, abundant amount of food. A world in which, well, I don't have to fear for my life because of enemy tribes, because, conflict was rampant. A world in which I wouldn't have to bury my children, at least, a large part of the children I will have in my life. Now, this would seem like a completely unthinkable utopia to them. It is clear that for many of us, and probably for the listeners to this podcast, hopefully for the listeners to this podcast, well, this dream has come true. Not only did this dream come true, the dream has actually been exceeded by reality, right? So we could never imagine all of the technological innovations that make our life more comfortable, all of these tools powered by electricity doing all sorts of tasks, that are otherwise very tiring and burdensome. Planes getting us to different continents, just to have a different experience. And I could, go on endlessly, obviously, with all of these innovations. The conditions in which we live today are so, fantastical when you look at it from that kind of perspective. But at the same time, then, well, one part of their dream wouldn't have been realized. They probably would have assumed that in this kind of world, well, we'll all be, floating blissfully through our worry-free lives, right? Enjoying ourselves to extreme degrees constantly. Well, that obviously didn't happen, right? What they wouldn't have foreseen probably is, that negativity bias, and in the absence of actual problems or real, big problems, well, just zooming in more and more and making first world problems making first world problems that take over our minds. Secondly, they wouldn't have anticipated this hedonic adaptation, the fact that we get used to all of these improved conditions. And as you mentioned, this being our new normal, and, well, we not being that much happier than previous generations. A bit happier, but not that much, right?
Yeah.
But, and this is where I'm so happy to leave the doom and gloom behind and look forward to all of the good stuff that is coming. But it is very important to know that you don't have to be a victim of this. Well, there are things you can do that will permanently and substantially increase, your happiness, increase the quality of the experience of your life. And this is very much where we're going to delve into in the next episodes. We're going to be talking about, the recipe for happiness, how you can train your brain to become happier, and so forth. So I look very much forward to covering that in the next episodes.
Same here, Michael. And for what it's worth, I am a very happy man.
Wonderful. So am I.
Right? I dare to say, by any standard, I'm a very happy man. I realize each and every day I feel blessed, right? As they say in the UK, count your blessings. I very much do that. I'm a very happy man. So I hope you are as well, Dr. Vlerik.
I am as well. Thank you, Aldo. That's already a scoop for what's coming, right? So counting your blessings is one of these things that research shows can have a very big impact on happiness. So coming up.
Coming up are these solutions, dear listener. Michael, thank you so very much for taking us through happiness again and modern times, where they work together and where they collide. It's been a fascinating interview. Again, I can listen to you for hours. In fact, I will listen to you for hours because we have some more interviews coming. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Michael Vlerik.
Thank you so much, Aldo. I look forward to the coming interviews.
If you liked this episode, then it would mean the absolute world if you could share it with your friends and or give it a short review on your preferred podcast platform. The more you share your ideas about these interviews, the more people will find out about them. So do let us know what you think. We'd be very, very grateful.
Special thanks to Philip Anderson for our beautiful theme music. This episode was edited by Natalie Piles with production assistance from Genta Metalia.